Good morning, my beautiful babes and babettes. I'm your resident active advocate, and I am sorry that I missed yesterday. Trust me when I say you did not want me making a video yesterday. I attempted to, but I was running on about 5 hours of sleep, and when I watched my work back, it didn't even make sense to me. So you know it's bad when. However, today I have returned to continue talking to you about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I want to clear up a bit of a boo-boo I made the last time I talked about this, because what I had said was to go and read it for yourself. However, I was not accounting for people who can't read the print document necessarily, or who prefer audio to visual. I could myself be a resource for reading for people who prefer to do it in the audio format, as I do myself, because of the obvious visual impairment. I mean, I didn't even account for my own visual impairment in making that statement, and that was stupid of me, quite frankly. I was going to use the pun short-sighted of me, but I thought that was low-hanging fruit. So basically what I'm saying is that if you like this as a format for reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, by all means, be my guest. However, I do stick to my statement that I want you to go and research for yourself, as I have been attempting to do for myself, because that part I can't do for you, A, and B, we may have differing opinions about different aspects of the TRC, what they mean, what they imply, what they mean for the future, and I don't want to step on any toes by saying that this interpretation is the interpretation. That's not how I operate, okay? So basically what I'm saying is that if this is a good format for reading for you, so long as I speak clearly, which I was not doing yesterday, then by all means, stick around. I love you. And we shall continue. So last time we left off with number 35, so today it will be numbers 36 through 40, all of which remain under the heading of justice. All right, so beginning, call to action number 36. We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to work with Aboriginal communities to provide culturally relevant services to inmates on issues such as substance abuse, family and domestic violence, and overcoming the experience of having been sexually abused. All right. Content warning. I'm going to be talking about a bit of information that I came across on social media in regards to sexual abuse at the residential schools. I want to avoid the topic of residential schools for now because more and more information is coming out. But on the news recently, on the mainstream news, they've basically been glossing over these issues. When the first residential school in British Columbia at Kamloops was dug up, it made headlining news. It was like the first or second story. Now, however, as more of these places are being dug up and more evidence of more lives lost and, things like that, as that continues to be found, these issues are being shunted further and further to the sidelines in the name of maintaining the everlasting 24-hour news cycle, which I despise because it is basically a method by which to go, you don't need to pay attention to this, pay attention to this. Look, it's new and sparkly. This is extraordinarily important, as I keep emphasizing as I talk about this. So I'm getting a lot of my information from social media, but I want to keep reading and keep tabs on what's going on. I believe that since the last time I spoke to you about this, 2 new residential schools in Canada have been excavated, shall we say, and more bodies have been found. But the numbers keep rising, and as I say, the mainstream news is not covering this. So in this particular call to action, basically what it is saying, in my interpretation, is that factors such as the sexual abuse or any other form of abuse that occurred within the residential schools need to be taken into account when a person is being brought to account for a crime that they could have committed. That and the fact that in the Canadian legal system, there isn't very much in the way of culturally specific help for Indigenous people who have committed crimes or who have been accused of committing crimes. Because, as I have said before, not only will non-white citizens of Canada, or in this case of their various Indigenous nations, not only will non-white people in Canada be more likely to be accused of a crime, they will also be more likely to be tried for the crime, to be found guilty for the crime, and to serve a longer prison sentence. That third one is actually very important in the upcoming points. So, with regards to this particular call to action, we need to find better ways of facilitating not punishment, but healing, because the TRC makes very, very clear in multiple different forms and in multiple different calls to action that the legacy of the residential schools is going to resound for generations to come. It's very much invested in the idea of generational trauma, as am I, because that is an extenuating factor pretty much for every single thing that goes on in the criminal legal system in regards to Indigenous peoples. I'm not saying it's the only cause for crime, okay? That would be reductionist of me to say. But generational trauma is going to screw a person up enough, maybe to turn to substance abuse, maybe to turn to crime, because these issues are not being dealt with by the mainstream, as I said, with the whole lack of news coverage on these terrible stories that continue to come and come in and come in, from all across the country. Right now, it seems to be focused more in the western part of the country, so Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia being our three westernmost provinces. But, this is going to come further east, and it's also going to go further south. I have a feeling that, this process is going to start in America at some point as well. So keep your eyes open, keep your ears open. Go, as I have said, to Indigenous peoples on social media to discuss these issues with them. But do your own legwork. It's not the other person's responsibility to, as I say, do research for you. Not my responsibility, but certainly not the responsibility of Indigenous peoples to do this research for you. Part of being a good ally or a good advocate is the capacity to do your own research and to find out the truth for yourself, which is why I advocate for reading, or in this case, listening to, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. All right, moving on to the next one. Number 37. Scroll, please. Thank you. We call upon the federal government to provide more support for Aboriginal programming in halfway houses and parole services. Okay. For those of you who don't know, halfway houses and parole services are basically, as the names imply, the halfway point between prison/jail and being sent back out into society after having been detained for however long your sentence was, okay? So in parole and halfway house services, ostensibly what they are priming you to do is to move away from the I am in prison, I am being confined mindset, which for no one is that healthy, to the, oh gosh, I'm free, what do I do with myself now mindset. A lot of people are going to have severe social and financial setbacks if they have been imprisoned, especially for a violent crime. And the ramifications of this can, extend throughout your entire life. And that is not a positive experience for anyone. The whole point, therefore, of parole services and halfway houses is to help you adjust to this new mindset of how not only society is going to view you, but how you are going to view yourself. That and getting you reinstated in society itself. Like, do you still have a house that you can go home to? Do you still have a job that you can return to? If the answer to either or both of those questions is yes, then how do we help you to transition from this to this? And that can be a very difficult process depending on how long you've been in prison/jail for. As I say, these places are not good for your psyche. And I advocate strongly for prison reform because the whole point of the North American prison system seems to be punishment rather than reform. And I don't think that that is beneficial, which is why the crime rate continues to go up. All right? It is not helpful to say to a person, you've been bad and therefore we're going to put you in a cage and basically keep you in solitary confinement, although that's a different thing. That's an accelerated version of the same thing. But basically we're going to keep you on your own for X amount of time. And because we are a social species, this is not good for us. Parole and halfway house services, therefore, are meant to help you readjust to being around people again, to being in mainstream society again, and having expectations of the real world and your real life being put back on you, so far as I understand it anyway, okay? I've never, thankfully, been to prison or to jail, and I don't understand the system in full, but there are actually very interesting YouTube channels about this. My brother, a few years ago, introduced me to a channel from a guy who was a former prison inmate, and he talks about his experiences in that world as compared to this world. Because let me be clear about this, these are two very disparate realms. In the prison and jail system, as I say, you are confined, you don't see other people. You're given not very good food, you're not given much time outside, and there's not very much in the way of expectation for you, other than that you sit alone and feel bad about what you did, all right? Whereas with mainstream society, you got a job, you got a family, you got things to do, you have responsibilities, you have, all of the noise and bustle of real life surrounding you. And those are two very different experiences, and it can be a shock to the system to go from one to the other. So in the case of this particular call to action, obviously, and I don't think this needs to be stated, y'all know how I feel about this, but the bulk of resources are going to go to the bulk of the population. So, white men, pretty much, okay? I'm not even going to gloss over that. White men are going to get the bulk of the resources, and that is not going to help any minority person, any minority communities that are otherwise represented within the prison/jail system. So this call to action is asking for more resources to be allocated where they're actually needed, especially since if you are of a particular minority status, in this case Indigenous, you're going to have a harder life than the titular white male is going to have outside of the prison or jail system. Okay, you just are. It's how society works. This society was built by and for the benefit of white men. I'm sorry, you can't get around that fact when it comes to things like this. And when it comes to systemic oppression, it's important to recognize that fact so that we can see where the need lies and where it needs to be fulfilled. All right, moving on to the next one, Number 38. We call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to commit to eliminating the overrepresentation of Aboriginal youth in custody over the next decade. Where's my icon? There's my icon. Minimize. Okay. This is a really big problem, okay? As I have said, if you are non-white, you are much more likely to be caught, convicted, and serve a longer jail/prison sentence than a white person who is caught and convicted of the same crime, okay? So white person steals a loaf of bread, Indigenous person steals a loaf of bread. What is the difference in their punishment? First of all, okay, this is just an example, for goodness sake, but really look into the actual statistics behind specific crimes and see the difference in penalty for the white person versus the non-white person. Indigenous youth and Indigenous people generally are highly overrepresented in the Canadian prison system because of this systemic racism and this systemic idea that these people are more violent, and pardon the use of the word savage, but that has carried on into modern times. You know, if you believe someone to be less evolved or less civilized than you, how are you going to treat them differently? Most likely it's going to be in a negative way. Even if you're not handing out a punishment to them for a perceived crime, it might even be such a form of negativity as, I need to teach you my ways because my ways are advanced to your ways, and of course you're going to get along better if you know and can implement my ways. Problem is, we tried that and it didn't work because the system refuses to let it work, A, and B, because we never should have done that to begin with. This is the whole idea of cultural hegemony gone wrong. Cultural hegemony is a very bad idea to begin with because it is saying that this kind of person is right, these kinds of people are wrong, you know, and it sets up these arbitrary ideas of group. It sets up the arbitrary idea of us versus them, and it sets up, as I keep harping on, the arbitrary hierarchy of white at the top, everyone else somewhere beneath that. So the whole idea is to equalize things so that you can actually look yourself in the mirror and say, I am doing a good job by way of other people, and not just my own, quote, kind of person. You know, I don't believe in the idea of groups any more than I believe in the idea of hierarchy. You know, this all has to boil down to the individual and to the individual crime in this case. And what would you give another person, just person, I don't care about the kind of person, for the same exact crime? You know, it's got to be the same across the board. Otherwise, you are looking at a perversion of justice. All right, next one. Oh boy. Number 39. We call upon the federal government to develop a national plan to collect and publish data on the criminal victimization of Aboriginal people, including data related to homicide and family violence victimization. Okay. The reason why I didn't publish my video yesterday was because of this exact point. I didn't read it properly and I misunderstood it. And when I watched it back, I'm like, nope, that is not what that means. All right, I want to address a particular case of justice gone wrong that happened out in British Columbia and continues to happen out west. And this has nothing to do with the residential schools, okay? Over the past decades, many Indigenous women in British Columbia have gone missing and are presumed to be dead. But the problem is these cases have largely been allowed to go cold in order that the system doesn't have to worry about these people who one presumes, you know, would just walk away from their community anyway, would walk away from their families, from their lives, because, you know, they're them. And this is so excruciatingly racist and ethnocentric and just nasty nasty, 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 that you wouldn't even look for these women, let alone attempt to find information about these women, and just allow these cases to go cold. This is just one example of what this call to action is talking about, okay? Crime amongst Indigenous communities is never very fully observed by outsiders due to the fact that we kind of just want to ignore it and ignore the systemic issues that are looking us in the face. Yes, I am getting passionate about this one, thank you. And the whole problem behind this is that if we cannot look at these issues, we cannot call this a justice system, okay? Justice should be for everyone. And when I say justice, I don't mean punishment. I mean, the proper fleshing out of what has happened, what continues to happen, and what we are going to do about it in the criminal realm, but also in the realm of, historical happenings on this continent. I firmly believe, heading off to the residential school sector of this, I fully believe that justice is not going to be implemented for this one, unfortunately, because much of that justice would fall upon the Canadian federal government, as well as on the Catholic Church. You see where I'm going with this one? No one's going to go after these massive, massive systems in order to enact real justice. Instead, what they're going to do is say, oh, these poor children, and leave it at that. And it's disgusting how we ignore these perversions of justice and these committing of crime by white people against Indigenous people and basically just call it square. Whereas when, as I say, an Indigenous person commits a crime, oh boy, do they clamp down on that one, because one represents all under the current system that we have, which I will not hesitate to say is a racist system. I do not stand in for my gender. I do not stand in for my sex. I do not stand in for my disabilities, plural. I do not stand in for my race. I am an individual. I want to make that very clear. No individual person is a stand-in for any particular group you see them belonging to, okay? No such thing as groups. Really, there's not. There's such a thing as group history because we have arbitrarily created such groups. But in reality, we are all individuals. And if we're going to be so bombastic about individual freedoms and rights, we need to stop treating the other as a collective and only ourselves as individuals. And in this case in particular, we need to look at the systemic wrong that has been done by grouping all Indigenous people together and by saying that they are not us, therefore we do not have to worry about them and what's going on in their communities, most of which are caused by us, all right? We need to stop that narrative in its tracks. And if your wife or mother or daughter or sister went missing, you would want something done about it, You would want them to be found, dead or alive, unfortunately. And if dead, you would want justice to be enacted, I'm sure, against the guilty party. So why do you think the sentiment would be any different in these communities? We're all people. We all feel the same way. That's the only group that we can intelligibly belong to, by the way, is the group of humanity as a whole. All right? That's a very important distinction. All right. Last one for the day. Scrolling to the top. Number 40. We call on all levels of government, in collaboration with Aboriginal people, to create adequately funded and accessible Aboriginal-specific victim programs and services with appropriate evaluation mechanisms. All right, so leaping off of the last point, people who are found to have been victims of violent crimes are often not given the treatment that they deserve. This is quite true in the medical realm as well as the judicial realm. I have actually heard of cases quite recently where, oh gosh, there was this particular case where an Indigenous woman died in hospital. And I don't know whether this is true, okay, but the nurse who was looking after her was apparently quoted as saying, "Oh, thank God we can have some peace now she's finally dead." Oh my various gods, like, come on, would you say this about a white woman? Would you say this about basically any person other than an Indigenous woman? I don't think you would, because unfortunately, in the hierarchy we have established, Indigenous people are often at the very bottom. And this was true even in America during, slave days. I'm going down south here, okay, but even during slave times and during the civil rights movement, you would rather be black than Indigenous. That's how bad it was. Indigenous people would sometimes pretend to be black in order to escape their systemic oppression. You know it's bad when, you know, because black people were and continue to be a very heavily oppressed group, very heavily oppressed individuals. And there has been a resurgence over the past while of violent crimes and, violent systemic racism against non-white people in North America, unfortunately, due largely to, that illness we're not allowed to talk about? Yeah, it's due to that. And a lot of it has been anti-Asian, but a lot of it has been directed towards people of other races as well. Because if you're angry, you want to find an outlet for your anger. And unfortunately, it will go against people who had absolutely nothing to do with it. This, by the way, is also a PSA that if you are committing acts of passive or active racism against Asian people at the moment, stop it. They didn't create this virus. They are not responsible for spreading it. Look to your own government for what is going on in your country right now with the virus, and look to their guidance and leadership, or lack thereof, for the reason why you are in the predicament that you are in right now. It's the same in Canada as it is in America, as it is in Europe, and all of these, Anglo-centric and white-centric countries where these acts of racism are being committed. But to stick to North America specifically, the death rate amongst Indigenous people for the virus that we're not allowed to talk about has been quite unreasonably high, for one thing. But even minus the virus that we're not allowed to talk about, people in Indigenous communities have a much lower, quality of life in terms of their health, and also in terms of, as we have discussed, the justice system. And both of these things are the result of systemic racism. Both of these things are the result of a lack of resources and a lack of cultural knowledge on the part of the white people, giving these resources to the people whom they have systemically oppressed and shunted to the sidelines. This is not right, and we need to do more, not just throwing money at the problem, but also going to the communities and to the community leaders and saying, what do you need? What do you need? And having the open mind and open ears enough to actually listen. My phone is ringing. That's the end of the video anyway. And I hope that you all have a lovely, lovely day, and I will see you tomorrow. Sorry for the abrupt end, but bye! Mwah.